Helldivers is one of, if not the best multiplayer game. It will forever be up there with multiplayer game giants, and if you know anything about Helldivers itself, I'm willing to bet most of you would say the same. Even with all the bugs, pun very much intended, it's just an amazingly well-crafted game that just has this passionate energy oozing from every facet of interaction that the player engages in. This passion extends out to the enemy factions that wage war with Super Earth. They are greatly detailed, and with several parts that point toward a variety of different biological and evolutionary functions. And this video seeks to explore one of those factions in great detail. With that being said, this video is, in concept, quite difficult to make, as Helldivers 2 is a live service game. In fact, the newest Helldivers major update at the time of writing, titled Into the Unjust, added several biologically interesting organisms, which I, sadly, will not be covering in this video as, of course, they are quite new, and I'd like to wait until further information is released on them. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to let you know that I am not very well versed in Helldivers lore as I am in other franchises, so this video is going to try to be a lot more fun than serious, but it will also be a lot more well researched than my previous videos. With that being said, the first major faction that can be seen in Helldivers, and the one which we'll be focusing on today, are the Terminids.
Never sleeps!
So, let's refresh ourselves on the basics of the Terminids. They are a race of millions of different bugs that are presumably most similar to ants on Earth. That is, if you gave ants 20 different types of super steroids and threw them into the void of space. Now, there are a few main pillars that the Terminids operate on. For one, spores. Terminids love spores. It's how they get around from planet to planet, which is interesting as biological organisms and the all-knowing void of space aren't exactly known to be on good terms with each other. But it can happen sometimes. The first thing coming to mind, of course, is water bears, who can survive the void of space for short times due to its impressive survivability. Who's to say that Terminid spores do not have some kind of jacked up version of this survivability? I presume that the Terminid spores work by getting into a state of inactiveness when in the void of space. Then they hit a survivable atmosphere, a chemical in that atmosphere will interact with the spore and activate it. These spores then presumably grow up into something like eggs, which hatch Terminids, which breed, which produce more eggs, which hatch more Terminids, etc., and that's the basics of the Terminid life cycle based on my research. Additionally, some agree with the theory that you can discern the Terminid's sex based on the color scheme they follow, that is to say, orange bugs being male and green bugs being female. This definitely falls more into speculation though, as most bug species, from Earth at least, operate on a mostly all-female basis, with few males littering their populations. The different color schemes of bugs could be interpreted as different castes in their social structure. Castes are generally defined as groups of individuals within the same species of social insects that have a different appearance, with that appearance usually going to serve their hive or colony. These green and orange bugs all follow their own line of development. There are several paths that they can take, one of the most common being Scavenger becomes Warrior, becomes Hive Guard, becomes Charger, becomes Behemoth. This path is only a single example out of several diverging and converging paths, with some even combining the green and orange color schemes, which I'll get to way later in this video, with units such as the Spore Charger or Nursing Spewer. I'm not going to list every path here, but I have made a hopefully easy to read diagram which shows my interpretations of these paths of development. As for the rest of the basics, of course, Terminids produce element 710 upon death, or as I'd like to call it, space oil, which Super Earth uses to power their Alcubierre drives, which is what allows them for faster than light travel. Otherwise, we can assume that the Terminids are standard organisms, being carbon-based, oxygen-breathing, good old insects. Now, I'll be organizing the ways that I present the different organisms in this video into tiers, and the first of those tiers on the list is the Terminid Scavenger tier. The first organism of the Scavenger tier is, well, the Scavenger. It's a small bug with a hard chitin shell that has 6 small appendages, 4 that are primarily used for walking, and 2 in the front which it can raise to attack its enemies with. These 2 front appendages have an extra spike coming down from them for, well, obvious reasons. Now, these spikes on their pincers may seem insignificant, but they are actually seriously important to looking at the evolution of the different Terminid forms, that is. No joke, this will actually come up a bunch of times in later organisms. Another important detail is the Scavenger's mouth. From it, we can obviously tell that the Terminids are herbivore. No, obviously they're carnivores. No surprise there. But what's interesting are these 2 curved spikes around their mouth. Again, these will be important in showcasing the consistency behind the different Terminid castes. Otherwise, I'd call the Scavenger your standard little guy. They're laughably weak, that is until 17 of them show up while a Charger's on your tail, or until a single one of them calls for mama and suddenly the entire hive is right around the corner, but otherwise, a shot from just about any gun, or even a whack from the hilt of any gun, should be enough to put these guys out of commission with relative ease. As for the other 2 organisms in the Scavenger tier, the Bile Spitter and Pouncer, they are more or less identical, with their only separating features being the features that separate entire castes. Important note here, for the sake of simplicity, I will now be referring to the 3 main castes as the Warrior caste, the Bile caste, and the Hunter caste. This is important to the rest of the videos. I don't know why I put it here. With that being said, the Scavenger tier's entry into the Bile caste is the Bile Spitter, which is essentially the same as the Scavenger with the double spiked front pincers and the curved spikes around its mouth. It is primarily different with its dark gray shell color and, of course, the bright green pustules and the abdomen. These are filled with bile, which allows the Bile Spitter to, get this, spit bile. Yes, I know, I'll take the Nobel Prize, as well as explode into bile upon death. Now, one would immediately assume that the bile is something akin to a Terminid's stomach acid. I don't think this is the case though, as if it were so, the rest of the Terminids would look a lot greener than they are now. In truth, I believe it's a separate acidic compound that this caste of Terminid produces for the purpose of defending their colonies at range. On a theoretical home planet, these Terminids would employ strategies similar to those that ants on Earth using formic acid would use, although on a much grander scale. See, certain ants will spray this tiny little acid when they feel threatened by something. This is obviously quite the effective strategy, the biological equivalent to bringing a gun to a sword fight, if you will, and I presume that the Terminids must have had competing species on this theoretical originating planet, which made an evolutionary need for this kind of unit. Now, as I said, this would only take place on a theoretical home planet, and that's because the existence of the Terminids as we know them today is actually attributed to Super Earth itself. See, Super Earth likes space oil. Like, a lot of space oil. And so, in the time between the First and Second Galactic War, bugs, as they were previously named, were farmed for the space oil that the decomposition of their body produced. However, this resulted in forms completely different to that of the form seen in Helldivers 1, and the Bile caste is among these ranks. It was entirely unseen in the previous game. Now, what could this imply for the bile that the Terminids produce? Well, maybe instead of a kind of formic acid like with earth ants, this bile could be E710 itself, only being chemically modified by the biology of the bile Terminids to be offensive in nature. But how do the bile Terminids house this bile without melting into a pile of Terminid slop? Well, that's where I believe the altered color of their armor comes in. You see, I believe that the shells of the bile Terminids are dark gray in coloration because they have a property that is resistant to the bile itself. This property likely extends to all parts of the bile Terminid, but uniquely interacts with their shells, which ultimately makes them a darker color. The Pouncer, on the other hand, contrasts this. Its shell is a much lighter color, which I can only assume is a form of camouflage for bright or sandy environments. It's the Scavenger tier's entry into the Hunter caste, and thus it has wings, and something which many may not have noticed, it actually doesn't have the double-spiked pincers. Rather, its pincers are sickle-shaped, which I assume is an adaptation that allows it to be more effective when attacking from the air. It may also play a part in the organism that is the pinnacle of its evolution, but we will cross that bridge when we get there. For now, the Pouncer is just a standard Scavenger tier enemy with the ability to easily and accurately close the distance to melee range. And now's a great time to say that all of the Terminids are actually blind. They have no eyes at all. They do, however, have a plethora of specialized sensory organs somewhere in there, and thus they can smell and hear anyone who may approach them. This makes the feats of the Pouncer and the Hunter caste overall just that much more impressive. Overall, the Scavenger tier generally gets overshadowed by the rest of the Terminid roster. However, they form the base that goes on to model the rest of the Terminids that will be seen in this whole video. With that being said, the next tier of Terminids is the Warrior tier. I have personally categorized 3 Terminids into the Warrior tier. Now, this might be controversial, but the first Terminid to be put into my Warrior tier is the Warrior. Upon first viewing it, it has a lot more of a uniform body structure than the Scavengers. Warriors are much larger and have a sturdy structure which allows them to be a, well, semi-deadly threat. It takes a lot less of them to overwhelm you than the Scavengers, but they still die fairly easily. One important subject of note, though, is the Warrior's nervous system. Never thought I'd say that. See, when you hit a headshot, well, it doesn't die. I don't know if I have footage of this, but essentially, the Warrior shows signs of a decentralized nervous system. What does this mean? Well, let's look at humans. They have a centralized nervous system, meaning the brain is basically connected to every other part of the body and controls them from up there. A decentralized nervous system, on the other hand, is like the whole brain being stretched out throughout the entire body. There can still be a centralized location which shows more activity than usual, but of course, if this area is eliminated, the body still goes on. Granted, this explanation was very basic, so if you want to learn more, please go research this because it's actually quite the interesting topic. Now, let's look at the details of the Warrior. If we direct our attention to its pincers, we see that the same doubled up pincers that were there on the Scavenger are now there on the Warrior as well, and it has the same 2 spikes around its mouth too. While again this seems insignificant, it's details like these that show us how the different forms of bugs go from one to another. If we really analyze the Warrior, we see that it actually looks just like the Scavenger, just a bit more elongated around its extremities. If we overlay the 2 of them, we see that the central body of the Warrior is almost identical to the full body of the Scavenger. This seems like an obvious design choice, but nowadays not all companies are willing to put so much effort into their designs in the first place. Now, the warrior is a prime example of what we would call the Terminids' first line of offense. Essentially, we'll see many different Terminids who are designed around either offense or each Terminid will have a particular trait designed for these respective purposes. And the next Terminid that I have placed into the warrior tier makes a great example of a Terminid which has taken on primarily defensive traits, and that is the Bile Spewer? Yes, I have put the Bile Spewer here, and I know what you're thinking. Zero, why would you put the Bile Spewer in the warrior tier if he's not a warrior? And to that my response is, technically he is considered the direct evolution of the Bile Spitter. Now you may be saying, but Zero, what about the Bile Warrior? I mean, that seems like a much more obvious choice, and so that my response is, I'll get to that in a moment. And by a moment, I mean a very long moment, like this timestamp on screen if you're really lazy and don't want to watch through the whole video, I guess. So why did I put the Bile Spewer in this category? Well, it fits my criteria for what I put in this tier, which granted I haven't disclosed yet because, well, I forgot. But just essentially, my criteria is that it's basically just because it fits into this category as a direct evolution from the previous one better than the Bile Warrior does. See, the base warrior is the most direct evolution of the base scavenger that we can observe, and by extension, the Bile Spewer is as close as we can get to the Bile Spitter. This is made most evident by the size of its pincers. They are noticeably as small or of a similar size to the ones on the Bile Spitter. It's a small detail, but that alongside the fact that Bile Warriors were seen far after the introduction of the Bile Spewer is what leads me to believe that the Bile Spewers are technically the quote-unquote warriors of the Bile caste. That was quite the long-winded explanation, but I care about these details and believe that they are important and fun to discuss. Now, the Bile Spewer is a medium-sized Terminid which also spews bile. However, it vomits it up in a far more consistent stream and actually does a significant amount of damage. Even with heavy armor, it can be quite devastating. Additionally, they have extra long-range capability by raising their abdomen and using a small gap at its tail end to fire concentrated bile at its target in a manner which is similar to a mortar. We notice that the Bile Spewer's pincers remain, but they are in a small, vestigial state. This is most obviously because the Spewer has no need for them. However, on extremely rare occasions, they can be to an extent used. It's just that with all the warriors, hunters, scavengers, and all the other bug kin surrounding them, they generally never have to resort to such an attack. In contrast, the rest of the Bile Spewer's legs are very enlarged so as to help with carrying the bile within their abdomen. Something interesting about this abdomen, however, is that for some odd reason it has armor on its top, but not the sides. Why is this? While at first glance you may assume that at some point the Terminids evolved to face an aerial threat, I believe this is not the case. Remember that many of the Bile Terminids were created for the purpose of farming E710. I think that the Spewer's abdomen being exposed on the sides, alongside the hole that it fires mortar shots from, show that this bug is specialized, designed even, for easy access to its abdomen, which is essentially one big barrel of space oil. In fact, the Spewer is so filled to the brim with this bile that it can even be seen deforming parts of its skin around its head, particularly its neck, which hangs down under the weight of the Bile Spewer's burden. A final note on the Bile Spewer is that it has the same spikes around its mouth that its predecessor has, and another set which has developed above those. Also, we see that its teeth are eroded from constant friction with the bile that it spits, which is, again, a nice detail. The next entry into the warrior tier is one from the Hunter caste. It's the Hunter itself. I named the Hunter caste after itself because all of the organisms following it in the Hunter caste will all share a resemblance with it. Some of these key features are the wings, currently designed for propelling long-distance jumps, the square-shaped mouth, which kind of looks like a bit like the Predator's mouth, which I'll actually touch on later, and notably, the same sickle-shaped pincers that the Pouncer had, with much more spikes. We already discussed the purpose of the sickles and wings, however, the wide mouth is an interesting adaptation, which I believe is for the purpose of making space for these holes here. I assume these are where the hunter's tongues stick out, which is something that they don't do often, generally only comboing it with their pounce. The hunter keeps the same kind of spikes around the mouth that the rest of the Terminids thus far have had. However, they look far straighter. This is likely due to its pouncing nature. These spikes likely puncture the target following the use of its pincers and a pounce. As a result of its quick nature, the hunter is far thinner in comparison to something like the warrior, and while this is the case, the hunter may have the greatest capacity of brain matter. That is to say, the hunter will attempt to do things like flank the enemy or sneak up on it, or even react to the laser sights of Helldiver weaponry. This is quite interesting, as it's one of the first signs we get of major intelligence, if not, dare I say, sentience. Whether or not they have sapience, though, is still up for debate. Overall, the organisms of the warrior tier are but the first in a long line of evolutions, which we get to see continued further in the next tier, which I have dubbed the medium tier. So, the medium tier. Why did I call it that? Well, the answer to that question is that I felt like it. To answer that question is it's classified. It's classified. So the first entry into the medium tier is actually the commander subsection of Terminids. This consists of two organisms which are essentially identical. For one, the brood commander is identical to the base warrior in all but size and color. It adopts a darker reddish color, which is likely the result of the activation of some chemical that indicates its higher status, interacting with the already present chemical composition of its insides. This higher status allows it to summon warriors to its aid. This is only a juvenile form, however, of the most common commander, the Alpha Commander. Again, the Alpha Commander is nearly the same as the juvenile Brood Commander, but slightly larger. However, it does have many additional details and behaviors that set it apart a little bit. For one, it's super spiky, like across its whole body, which makes sense. If the warriors are the first line of offensive, then these guys are the special offensive forces. They are much faster in both movement and attack speed. And the more prominent spikes across their body likely allow them to still get damage even if they miss an attack within their sporadic barrage, although this isn't translated as a feature into the game. They require a lot more damage to be killed. This damage also needs to be dealt quickly. If not, then it will enter the berserk state I mentioned earlier. But this one is different from the rest. It's restless and is probably the result of like 50% of all my deaths on the Terminid front. This unit can also summon a specialized form of the standard warrior, which is basically just the brood commander but smaller and without any summoning capabilities. It is, however, much faster than the standard warrior, allowing it to keep up pace with even lightly geared Helldivers in some cases. Interestingly, the Alpha Commander is not quick to initiate a fight. When at range, if a Helldiver does not engage, it will retreat for a moment, as if it's showing hesitation before moving in for the kill. This is a pointer, again, towards a greater intelligence in certain Terminid units, and to a certain extent, the Terminids as a whole. Now, the next unit in the medium tier is the Shrieker, as it appears to be the next step up in Hunter evolution. The first thing you might notice about the Shrieker are its arms. Nah, I'm just kidding. Obviously, this unit is derived from the Hunter, and it has wings which have massively enlarged, allowing for flight. It does, however, keep the standard details we've seen in the Hunter thus far. What's primarily interesting about these guys, though, is their behavior. See, rather than taking up the same kind of housing that the rest of the antlions do, that is to say underground, the Shrieker has a specialized nest structure which will consistently produce Shriekers until destroyed. These mushroom-like structures seem to have several little eggs on their undersides which presumably constantly hatch Shriekers. This structure shares a distinct resemblance with another structure called the Bile Spewer, which is one that distributes the spores that I spoke of earlier. The Shrieker nest could be derived from the Bile Spewer, but it is unclear. As for the final notes on it, overall, the Shrieker has a darker color of armor, which is likely due to its origination as a mutation, and its behavior is generally basic, where it simply circles around the player and dives every once in a while to slash at them. And as a side note, I noticed that at the time of writing, the wiki for the Shrieker says that they can pick up Helldivers and carry them up a few meters before dropping them, As far as I know, this is completely false, completely untrue, and it's a good example of why wikis shouldn't be your only source of information. You should also use things like experience and, well, you know, other sources. Now, our next and final unit, which I have classified under the medium tier, is the Hive Guard. This unit is very similar to the Warrior in its general body structure, with the only major difference in that regard being its torso being a bit thicker than the average Warrior's, which may be a hint towards its eventual development into a Charger. Its armor, on the other hand, is quite different, being far thicker and requiring a level up in ordnance to destroy. What's interesting is the color of this armor, which is the same color as the armor that can be seen on Bile Spewers. This is no coincidence, as the same adaptation to keep your insides from getting out can also be applied when trying to keep your outsides from going in. It's a great detail on the part of the designers and shows just how cohesive they have been with their character design. Now, this armor is shaped in a particular fashion that allows the Hive Guard to essentially create a wall with its own body. This is a semi-common trope that we see among earth insects and arachnids called phragmosis, which is when an organism uses a specialized part of its body as a barrier of entry or defense to its burrow. The first organism, or more accurately image, that may come to mind when you think of this trait is the turtle ant. If you've had any interest in entomology, or really just the biology of any small invertebrates in the past couple of years, which I definitely have, then you've probably seen this image, an image of a turtle ant's oddly shaped head. They use this trait as a kind of door that blocks the way into their hive. Similarly, I believe that the Hive Guard is adapted to this precise purpose, although it's definitely on a much different scale. It's likely that they would form a line that acts as a large wall spanning across the perimeter of said hive, although we can't say for sure, as the only times we really interact with them is when they are in active combat, in which the tactics they employ are defensive in nature but primarily offensive. When in an altercation with a Helldiver, they will first immediately approach them. Then, if the Helldiver attempts to run past them, they will either attack or strafe sideways in an attempt to block the Helldiver, possibly giving other units the opportunity for an attack. Now, if said Helldiver instead decides to fire upon it with a weapon that does not have appropriate armor penetration, it will enter the stance of the wall defense that I mentioned earlier in an attempt to defend itself. The next tier, which I have come up with myself, is the heavy tier. This tier is categorized, as you might expect, with entries from the three castes that are excessive in size or armor, with only one exception being the Stalker. Our first enemy into the heavy tier is the direct evolution of the Hive Guard from the medium tier. This organism is the Charger, but before we fully move on to the heavy tier, to elaborate on how the Hive Guard may transition to this unit, I've scored a collaboration with fellow YouTuber Sladen, popularly known for his work on the theoretical 4th Helldivers faction, War Dogs. He's here to give his take on how a transition between the Hive Guard and the Charger would look. So, without further delay...
Hello everyone, I drew up this concept once I heard that Below Zero was working on a video on the designs for the bugs in Helldivers 2. I'm very surprised no one else has made a video similar to this, which is that's crazy to me. So let's have a look at this little guy I came up with. For the time being, we're going to call this guy a Hive Sergeant, as it is a higher position than a guard. For the design, I wanted to make sure that the Hive Guard would develop the survival traits the Charger has in a very natural way. No longer just being used as a blockade on the battlefield, this guy has started to develop armor on its back limbs and sturdier, thicker armor on its forelimbs. Its head crest has started to curve out forward to better deflect debris. I came up with the idea that during the transitional phase, the skin starts to flake off, being replaced with thicker, sturdier armor to better protect its squishy insides. But during this phase, it leaves the sides and rear exposed to the elements, unintentionally making these obvious weak spots. I wanted to include these orange spines. I don't really know what they are, but they look cool and it's a great way to add color to the design. I am so glad I got the opportunity to be a part of this video. I love the Helldiver designs for their enemies. They're so sick. They're really good. I could talk about them forever. And the concept of the bugs evolving into one another is really cool. And I would love to see someone's take on the in-between stage of a Bile Warrior and a Bile Titan. There's a big gap between these two, so there's a lot of room to play with for a really cool concept. I'd love to see someone's art for it. If any of you guys want to see your own little creepy crawlies drawn up, just commission me on my Ko-fi, as my commissions are up. That's all I have to say on the topic, and I hope you all have a good day spreading the good word of democracy.
And that we will, Sladen. Thank you so much for your valuable insight and the design that you made for this video. I'm truly grateful that you chose to showcase the lesser seen aspects of biology in fictional mediums, which is, of course, the creation of an organism itself, and considering gameplay aspects when designing them. And as he said, he's a super great artist, draws all kinds of stuff, and you can support him on Ko-Fi with an art commission. Thank you again, Sladen, for the collaboration, and with that being said, the Charger is our first big Terminid, eclipsing the size of the Bile Spewer by about a quarter or double. Its armor is significantly thicker than any bug on this entire analysis thus far. Once again, this armor is colored the same as the armor on Bile units, suggesting the same Bile composition being utilized for alternative purposes. In the case of the Charger, as its name suggests, it will rapidly charge at the Helldivers when it manages to recognize one. Its legs have not necessarily gained anything akin to muscle mass, but in reality, its new shell has been described as a meter, or 3 feet, thick across the most heavily armored parts of its body. So just imagine something as tough as a small vehicle running at you. Maybe not as fast as the vehicle itself, but definitely with more physicality and perceived intent. The Charger's face, if you could even call it that anymore, has the same set of spikes around the mouth. However, it's been doubled up for what I can only presume to be maximum killing efficiency. Notably, this is a development that we would begin to see in the Hive Guard and even a bit in the original Warrior. The Charger also sports a far evolved version of the pincers seen on these previous forms. They have a much more crab-like appearance, which means yet another species has fallen victim to carcinization. I'm just kidding. No. But it is interesting that Terminids have evolved the same kind of pincers that crabs have. On Earth, these would generally be used to pick up prey or really just grasp anything, but in the Charger's case, they are likely to be used in extremely niche situations, if not then completely vestigial. Additionally, the tip of the Charger's head sports 3 sharp spikes. These were most obviously developed to significantly damage their prey. However, they play a pivotal role in the explanation behind one of the later organisms. As for the Charger's behavior, when naturally patrolling or lingering in an area, the Charger will often be completely still or move at a slow pace, only reacting to sound or significantly close proximity. It makes sense that the Charger would not be as easily provoked as the rest of the bugs. It probably serves to conserve the Charger's energy, and the armor likely suppresses a lot of its sensory organs. Once it is provoked, it will turn toward the source of the provocation and, well, charge. This charge can be devastating, being able to easily break multiple bones at once, and if the Charger misses, it can also crush Helldivers with its front legs. But why do Chargers charge in the first place? Well, we know that Terminid zoos exist to an extent through the form of Tyranny Park and Tyranny Park 2. We also know that genetically engineering Terminids is something that Super Earth does often. I wouldn't be surprised if the Chargers were bred and conditioned in a way that is similar to bullfighting or bull chasing or whatever. It's kind of a far-off theory, but it is possible, especially considering that the Tyranny Park 2 MO had a lot to do with Chargers, although I wasn't there myself, so I don't know the specifics. Overall, the Charger is an absolute unit of the Terminid, being what is essentially the final form of the Terminid warrior caste. However, the Charger has 2 offshoots which are specialized for a dichotomy of offense and defense, with the first, offense, being the Behemoth. This will be a short section because it's not all that different, but the Behemoth is a minor evolution of the Charger, which is made larger by significant extensions to its body armor, which are a lighter brown and kind of grayish in coloration. These extensions are very visibly designed for offensive purposes. This is most notable on its face, where the several spikes that were previously present have been reorganized into 3 large spikes, which likely allows for more effective impaling. Additionally, 3 large plates have been added to each leg of the Behemoth, which may allow for the Behemoths to charge more effectively and inflict fatal wounds through bone breakage on a Helldiver. Otherwise, the only real difference about this guy in comparison to the Charger is its teeth, 4 of which have gotten significantly larger for, well, obvious reasons. Now, the next organism in the heavy tier is another variation of the Charger who has instead gone down the path of defense in a unique way. This organism is the Impaler, but now I think would be a good time to mention the fact that these models are from a Gary's Mod add-on, which ripped the assets straight from the game. And while these do work with the automatic stand posing tool, sometimes the posing gets a little weird, and the Impaler is essentially our only example of this. So just bear with this model, please, because it's still the same model, it just looks weird. It looks very weird. So, the Impaler is definitely the more interesting charger variant of the two, with the thickest armor of all the Terminids currently present on the battlefield, with the exception of, that one guy that's not featuring in this video. Now, the majority of the Impaler is all but standard. His main body is really just a bigger version of the Charger's body. However, the most interesting part of the Impaler is, of course, its head, which has somehow been split into 3 long, extendable appendages. At the end of each one is a hardened spike made from the same material that the rest of its armor is made from. That's not all. Not only does it have tentacles, but it has tentacles that can burrow underground independently from each other and pop up out of the ground in varied locations. Now, as far as I know, we don't really have any real-world parallels to this. There are insects with tentacles, but obviously, as far as I know, there are no insects or animals that can bury appendages into the ground and extend them long enough for them to come out on the other end. The Impaler's appendages in particular seem to be specialized for this purpose. They have a bunch of ridges on them, which allows this appendage to more easily plunge into the terrain of various planets. As for why they may have adapted such a trait, well, it's easy. This would be an extremely advantageous adaptation, essentially allowing a unit to defend its colony from the inside. And while we never actually see it doing that, I don't doubt that it's widely used among Terminid colonies for that purpose. While these tentacles are the most prominent part of the Impaler, they are not, to me personally, the most interesting part. As when they're dug into the ground, we see this array of 27 eyes, or otherwise sensory organs. This is the first recorded instance of true sight in a Terminid. These, albeit primitive eyes, were likely evolved in conjunction with the Impaler's signature ability. Considering that there are no sensory organs at the end of each appendage, these probably allow the bug to know where to attack with its tentacles when they are plunged into the ground. And to confirm that these are eyes and not sensory organs, if we look closely enough at the model, we can just barely make out a pupil. As a final note on the Impaler, I'd just like to mention that while most people can't see this, the Impaler's mouth is actually visible from under its tentacles, and it does follow the structure of previous Terminid mouths that we've observed the structure of, which is a nice touch from the developers, as they could have added anything there and no one would really have noticed or cared, except for me, of course. And that concludes the Chargers, and by extension, the rest of the Warrior cast, but there remains 2 more casts to be concluded, the next being the Hunter cast, which is concluded with the Stalker. The Stalker is the largest hunter form that we've seen thus far. Its appendages have grown long and skinny, and upon its shell is a plethora of black markings. These markings would, to a degree, help the Stalker be more concealed in dark environments, although these markings are minimal because, of course, the Stalkers have the unique ability to camouflage themselves to match their environments. This ability is said to be the result of Terminid gene splicing research, although I presume that if this kind of bug were to evolve without this unique ability, it would have come to have an entirely black shell. The dark of these markings can most prominently be seen on its head, which also features wing-like structures, and most notably, a mouth with 4 corners which has a spike protruding from each of them. This mouth can also expand extremely wide. Interestingly, I feel that this mouth structure is an allusion to the mouth structure of the Predator. It's still quite different, but the similarities are definitely there. Now, within its mouth, it has a tongue, just as the Hunter had, but much longer and far more powerful. It can knock a stable Helldiver off its feet with ease, and that's just its tongue. Its main form of offense are its arms, which have gone from sickle-like claws to full-fledged raptorial forelegs. These are very similar to those seen on a praying mantis. It, of course, uses these appendages to slash at any Helldivers who it's decided to hunt. See, the Stalker has a unique way of engaging in offensive altercations. It appears to showcase the most sophisticated thinking thus far, as it will almost always try to flank Helldivers, and if they get close enough, they'll either use their tongues or claws to strike. If the Helldiver dies, they'll move on, but if the Helldiver lives and deals them enough damage, the Stalker will actually retreat and try again after healing. But that's not the extent of their thinking capacity. In certain cases, Stalkers will attempt to lure Helldivers away from their squad by backing away from them as the Helldiver gives chase. It doesn't always work, as Helldivers are generally equipped with explosive weapons like the Eruptor and just blow them up from afar, but it still remains a completely unique ability to themselves and shows that they take their spot as one of the smartest Terminids on the battlefield. Now, the final unit on the heavy tier is the one you've probably been anticipating this whole time, and if you've made it this far without skipping ahead, I commend you, for now, we finally analyze the most iconic of the Terminids, the Bile Titan. This hulking beast of a bug is one of the most dangerous Terminids that a Helldiver could possibly encounter. It truly has come a long way since its humble beginnings as a mere Bile Spitter, but we still see some factors that identify them with each other. Most prominently, we see the color of its shell, but a more detailed look shows that it has kept the same doubled up spikes that were able to be seen near the mouths of its predecessors, with the pincers also being this way, still divided into two parts, although they have been largely elongated. What is definitely different from the Bile Titan compared to those predecessors is their massive impaling legs. See, if you happen to get too close to this beast, you'll be sure to be impaled by its legs turned massive spears, but don't think running from it will save you, as it retains the ranged capabilities of its predecessor. But of course, in classic Terminid fashion, the Spew of Bile is bigger and far more dangerous. It can, however, be easily dealt with by destroying its bile sacs, thus forcing it to only use melee. Now, why would such a huge bug ever need to be evolved in the colony? Well, the answer is, as is usual for this cast, space oil. I presume that the bigger the bug, the bigger the production of space oil for Super Earth to farm up and turn into fuel for their super destroyers. Were the Bile Titans to have developed independently, however, I would presume that it would have appeared out of a need for colonies to have defense against threats from high altitude areas. Similarly to the Impaler, the Bile Titan's practical use likely boils down to a defense of a hive or outpost with an exposed roof from behind a wall, in a way using its spew of bile as a kind of turret. This purpose is made more evident by the fact that it has now developed twice the bile sacs as the Bile Spewer. Now, if I may suggest a wild theory, my guess would be that this abomination was the result of Super Earth trying to combine two Bile Spewers into one organism, assuming that it would produce twice the E710. I know, it's frankly stupid, but let's not forget that they used ants as a gauge for whether or not Terminids had hive intelligence.
In other news, recent reports cast doubt on the theory of swarm intelligence, as ants fail to solve simple puzzles.
Propaganda or not, that is not the most smart move. A final note for the Bile Titan is that while not exactly canon, I don't know for sure, the Bile Titan can sometimes twitch upon death. This has resulted in, well, unsavory moments for our dear Helldivers. I would, of course, attribute these to a decentralized nervous system, although, of course, to a much lesser extent than something like the Alpha Commander. Although a variant of the Bile Titan that runs at you before dying if you headshot it with something like a recoilless rifle would be awesome. Arrowhead, please add that, please. Now, this is the end of the video, but you might have noticed that there were a few Terminids which I didn't cover, namely the Nursing Spewer, the Bile Warrior, and the Spore Charger. I won't talk about these guys at length because I couldn't find a place for them in the pacing of this video, but essentially, I think they're all the result of Super Earth intervention or some kind of accident within the Terminid ranks, possibly influenced by the TCS. See, I believe that the caste a Terminid becomes a part of is determined by a certain chemical or pheromone it's exposed to at birth. I believe that the Bile Warrior and Spore Charger are the result of a Terminid being exposed to multiple of these at once, thus resulting in a hybrid. And as for the Nursing Spewer, I believe, as its name suggests, it's a simple adaptation of the standard Bile Spewer to nurse scavengers more effectively to adulthood. I believe that was specifically brought on by a mutation from the TCS. Other organisms that I didn't talk about are the variants like the Predator strain and Spore Burst strain. Well, I'm saving those ones for one-shot videos in the future, particularly because I don't want this one video to eat up all my biological Helldivers content, and also partly because the script for this video at the time of writing is precisely 6,912 words long, and this is the 11th page. And for context, this is just for one faction. One faction. This video was originally planned to cover all of them, so yeah, most evidently the Automatons and Illuminate will both get their own analysis. So with that out of the way, Thank you guys so much for watching. This video breaks another record for being the longest one I've ever produced, and I think that's in part because I really wanted to improve from my last one, which over time boiled down to a bunch of descriptions. During the production of this video, I actively researched and watched biological videos made by fellow YouTubers and other news sources, and thus it will have them linked in the description. On the topic of fellow YouTubers, this video is also my first real collaboration. Thank you so much to Sladen for giving some of his input on this video and for the art that you saw during that section. It's so cool. I mean, it's so cool. I don't know what else to say. It's awesome. And hey, maybe potentially you might just see me in one of his videos. With that being said, thank you all so much for watching to the end of this crazy long video, and goodbye.